Good afternoon, everybody. So I just wanted to say before John starts his talk that if anybody in the audience is adversely affected by anything that they see on the stage this afternoon, we don't do therapy. However, we do provide a free tool for you to deal with the problem that we're about to outline. And you can sign up for the free community app at silentpush.com. And then you can audit your DNS records. Actually, you can audit anybody else's DNS records, so you might want to get there first, right? So this research came as a result of our investigations into the lapses group and the fact that there was an awful lot of session cookie stealing going on, and we want to investigate all the ways that it can be done. And as we have a comprehensive view of everything that exists every day and the changes that happen on a daily basis, we decided to make a tool and do some research around this exact problem. So with that, I'll turn it over to John. Okay.
Thank you. So dangling DNS is the topic, and dangling DNS is a wide range of things, but it's often, I think the main thing about it is that it's underestimated as a problem. So we're going to have a look at some of the reasons why this is actually a problem that we shouldn't underestimate and what the consequences are of these things. So we'll be looking at what dangling DNS records are, why they're dangerous, the different types that we can find, and then how to find them, and some of the things that we can do with them once we have them. We'll go from kind of the simple, the basic, and then gradually build up through the range of consequences that we can expose ourselves to by ignoring this problem. So first thing, what is a dangling DNS record? Well, essentially, it's one record pointing to another record, and the target record does not exist. And so that's kind of a general scope for this. So it's not limited to any particular record type. The principle applies across a multitude of different combinations of records that can point somewhere else. And so I think the reason why the dangling DNS problem is underestimated is that because records point to nothing, it's easy to assume that, okay, well, there's no real side effects of this because there's nothing there. So the problem actually is that anyone potentially could bring something to exist at that target point. So the graphic here we have is from a Microsoft website. So it kind of describes the different stages. For typically, what most people are talking about when they're talking about dangling records is primarily CNAME records, but as we'll see, there's many, many other types as well. The CNAME record is basically a name pointing to an A record, typically. And so when that becomes dangling, that's because the A record has been removed. And in cloud environments, that's quite common as an effect of the kind of dynamic nature of cloud infrastructure. And so in step 3, then someone else takes over that same record. And now what was originally pointing to a genuine website is now pointing to something under his control. So we can see from the graph that Microsoft are aware of this particular problem. Unfortunately, they're not actually doing anything to prevent it from taking place in their own cloud. So everybody who has some infrastructure in cloud environments need to take those precautions for themselves. But it's not limited to just a cloud environment. Okay, so why this is dangerous? So we briefly mentioned that, okay, if anyone could bring this target back into existence, or it could be hijacked through different means. And the key thing is that once this target is under someone's control, they can put anything there. So you can ruin your company's reputation by putting up malicious sites. You can host malware and things like that. You can call it impersonation, but technically it's not impersonation because you're actually using the person's own website. So that makes the detection of this, particularly content monitoring and filtering rules and things like that, makes it very, very difficult to detect this particular kind of problem because if you get a malicious link, it's actually your own domain that's in it. And so most filtering or content filtering solutions can't really handle that problem because it's not seen as an actual problem. So all of these things can go quite bad very easily if someone else controls what is in your site. And the most kind of serious problem is that if you can embed one of these impersonated, or for simplicity, let's call it impersonated site, but technically it's not. It's actually a part of your site that's under someone else's control. And once you have that, you can actually steal anything that is within that domain scope. And so that could be session cookies, for example. It could be single sign-on sessions as well that would operate in the domain scope. If you can embed yourself with a subdomain record within that domain scope, you have free access to all of the single sign-on cookies, and you can harvest them. And we'll see some examples. We have a demo later on where we can show this in a sandbox. Okay, so the different DNS record types that could be ending up dangling. Like CNAME is on the top of the list because that's the one that everybody thinks about when we talk about dangling DNS records, but it applies to many other types. So it kind of picked, the most common ones here. Name server records, MX records, and so on. That's fairly straightforward. They both point to A records or quad A records, depending on what the IP version is. The glue record is something slightly different. When you register a domain, you have to also provide name servers for it at the registration step. But you're not always required to actually set up your domain on those name servers. So that means that the information and the registrar side and the actual fact in the rest of the world could become out of sync. And so there's an opportunity to take over some of those as well when this information doesn't match. So this could happen for a number of reasons. Like it could be just as part of setting up a domain, but not completing all of the administration work around that. When you're provisioning domains and infrastructure through scripts, as in infrastructure as code, things like that, if there's something that fails in your script, if there's not a proper cleanup, as part of that process, you might end up with incomplete configurations and things like that. The other ones are a little bit outside of what I'm going to talk about today, but they're on the slide as well because we shouldn't forget about them. So things like includes and SPF records can expose you to a multitude of different things, because in the SPF records you have includes that are both names, so they could be aliases for other records, but you also have IP space in there. And you'd be surprised if you expand the list of all the includes that are given to you when you set up a cloud service, for example, and set up a mail service there. They have a set of default SPF records that they want you to add to your domain. If you actually expand that list of IP addresses that is kind of embedded in all of those chains, you can end up with allowing email from your domain to originate from millions of IP addresses. So at the same time there, if there's an MX record included, this could be referred to as just the fact that it's an MX record, or it could be referred to by name. And if those names don't exist either, they're able to be taken over in a similar way. The last two are a little bit different because these are actually A records pointing to IPs. And so this is a valid IP. It's a valid A record that points to an IP. The problem there is that the IP may no longer be under your control. And that's also common in cloud environments where you provision VMs, shut them down, start it back up again. Now, the second time this comes back, it's not the same IP address that it had the first time. So if you don't update your A record, it's now pointing to the previous IP. But someone else who's starting up VMs in that same cloud service could now be allocated that IP address, and so now your record points to a server that's under someone else's control. So again, in the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the first 3 or 4 of these record types and give you some examples of what we can do with those. So what are the risks? What are the actual risks, right? The CNAME is obvious, and that's well documented. We can take over a website or a subdomain, and including anything else that is accessible within that scope. So these are typically single sign-on, cookies, anything that the browser will give us when it's talking to something under our control. But also, if we're looking to destroy someone's reputation, we can put up, malicious content on that site, and it'll look to anyone who connects to that as if you are providing it, right? If it's your site. Name servers give us a lot more opportunities for creating badness, because the entire domain zone is served from name servers. So if we can take control of one or more, or even all of the name servers for that domain, we can manipulate any of the records that are there. So that essentially gives us full control. In most cases, it's not that simple, but in most cases, what we can do is we can take partial control. So typically, when you configure a domain, you're required to give at least 2 name servers. But if one of those name servers is wrong and we can take it over, then we effectively have full control of 50% of the traffic that goes to your domain, and we can do anything we want with that. And that's we can escalate that problem as well. Once we get the first connection or see the first traffic, we can do other things with that as well. MX similar, but this is particular to email flow. You can start receiving some or all of incoming email, but more importantly, you can also send valid email from someone else's domain. Because DMX records are typically referred to as a general alias in SPF records. So even if you have SPF records set to be enforced for your domain, this connection now qualifies because it's an actual valid MX record. Similar thing, like glue is probably a bit of a bigger problem because we can take over the full domain zones there. So this is a variation of the name server dangler that we had before. And we mentioned some of the SPF and A record problems as well. So the kind of common misconfigurations that we'll see, actually the root problem is that the target record no longer exists. And that could be for a number of reasons. So deprovisioning on cloud service is very common. Incorrect name that is put in a misspelled domain name, things like that is very common as well. And then abandoned configurations. Abandoned configurations could be part of you manually setting up a domain and then not completing the full process, but it's also common in scripted infrastructure that the script fails to complete and there's no proper cleanup afterwards. So there's a multitude of different things that can go wrong, and it'll end up with dangling records as a result. So one of the kind of simpler cases is that people can't spell. So this is a fact of life, and it occurs in technology as well as in the rest of the real world. So in this case, we can see on the left, we have whois information, which is essentially the registrar information that is presented in the whois format. In there, whoever bought this domain registered the name servers with NS1, 2, and 3, melbourneIT.net. And that's fine. So then what we can do is now we can go to any one of those name servers and ask, what are the name servers for this domain? And when we do that, we get NS1, 2, 3, 4, melbourneIT.net. But they forgot that they were in Melbourne, that is spelled with an E, so they didn't put it in. So even if we're on melbourneIT.net, a server that has an E in it, the actual configuration inside did not put the E in. So this is probably done, I'm guessing, Friday afternoon at 5 or Monday morning at 8 or something like that. So the effect here is that the outcome here is that we've now actually delegated our domain to some other name servers, because these are authoritative name servers and they now point somewhere else. So we have a full chain of authority for each of these queries that we do, and that means that we get valid information back. And so in this case, the valid information is wrong. The next thing that we can see is that the final domain without the E does not actually exist. So that means we can buy it. When we do that, we can now create those hosts, NS 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now all bets are off. Now rules no longer apply. Now we have full control of all of those. So we can set up all of them or just one or two of them. That's our choice. If we set up all of them, we're going to have a very high likelihood of seeing all the name resolution traffic for this domain. Not immediately because things are cached and things like that. That's how DNS works. Eventually, we're going to see a very high proportion of traffic for this domain. And now we can send back anything we want. Right? So we can start up gently, and then first we can try and replicate all of the records that exist on the real servers and send that information back. And then we can gradually introduce malicious resolution results into this process, or we can just do it for a short time. If we're impersonating or if we're attacking someone with a spear phishing attack or something like that, this could be very helpful to be able to actually present fake websites within the target's own domain. So this is quite a risk. So that's kind of a starting example of misspellings, that they actually have a real effect in the real world. So what we really want to do is we want to figure out a way of finding these so that we want to look at this from a defender's point of view, right? So the attacker has a different view. He wants to find them because he wants to exploit them, or he wants to get a bonus for finding this malicious potential for malicious use. But as a defender, we want to find them so we can prevent this problem from happening in the first place. So, how do we do that? Well, it's kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack. The problem is the needle is very small and the haystack is enormous because it's kind of, we're left to do this in almost a brute force kind of way. Like, it's very simple to do the lookup, right? We can use just a common DNS tool, dig, look up a name and see if it resolves to an IP address. And all of those name chains always end up with an IP address. And so when that's the case, it's not a dangling record. So that means this is fine, and we can move on to try the next one. And so we have another one below. We try and use dig for that name and see if we get an IP address back eventually. So in this case, we don't. We just get another name. But we don't have a name chain to follow to all the way through to an IP address. So in this case, this is a dangling record. However, there are millions of these, right? Billions, in fact. So let's say that worldwide there might be 500 or 600 million domain names. But in the case of CNAMEs, the domain name itself is not actually relevant for this kind of attack because you cannot have CNAMEs on the apex of a domain, so that has to be on a subdomain or a host name. And there are many, many more of those. So there's actually many billions of these. So doing this with this classical brute force technique is actually not feasible at any kind of scale. And so when you read about these kind of dangling records and people who are investigating this and using this kind of method, the kind of results that they come up with after they've been doing this for quite a while, the biggest result set that I've seen anyone producing is about 48,000 or 50,000 domains or host names coming out of this, doing it this way. Right, so we want to see if we can do better. So we need a new way of doing this. So what we do here, because as Ken mentioned, we're doing all of the data collection every day, we're resolving all of the names that exist and that we can trace on DNS. So it's really an extended version of, it's not just passive DNS collection, this is active DNS collection and to all of the levels of names that we can find. And we do this completely every day. So this is many billions of records that we generate through this method. And so that we have a continuously up-to-date record set containing all of this DNS information with all of the different record types that are relevant for this particular problem. So now we can look at doing this with a database-based solution. And that's in theory, something that should be able to do things at a much bigger scale, because there's no longer a brute force. Essentially, we can reduce this to a set problem. And so what we specifically do in this case is that we find the partition symmetric difference between the different sets of record types. And so the way that we feed data into this is it follows the principle from what we saw before, in that C names point to either A records or quad A records. The same for our name servers and MX records as well. So basically, what we do is we can take the C names, all of them, and then subtract all of the other records that are relevant, so all of the target records. And so in an ideal world, which I think doesn't exist, if it did, the outcome of that difference operation would be an empty set, right? Because ideally all the C names should map to A records, and we'd be laughing, right? We wouldn't have anything to worry about. So this is obviously not the case. So when we do this, we'll take the C names, subtract all of those. So now we have dangling C names as the outcome of this. We can do the same for name servers and MX records. And so obviously you probably guessed that we're going to be able to find more than 50,000 C names using this method. So if you have put a number in your head and think about how many you think we might find of the C name type, let's say, just using this method. And then I'll show you the actual number here. So when we do this, we've now gone from a record set containing 50,000 C names to about 5.2 million for C names alone. And so now we also do the same for the other record types. So name servers is a lot smaller, but the impact of those is a lot higher. MX records also a considerable number, so 3.5 million of those, 5 million C names and so on. Glue record is quite a big problem. So we have almost 22 million dangling glue records. We have time at the end to have a small section on the glue record specifically. And there's a number of reasons why this number could be this high as well. But in fact, we've now found these. So from an attacker's point of view, this is valuable information because he's now in a target-rich environment. And he can basically pick and choose any of these and do with it whatever he wants. If he's a bug bounty hunter, there might be money to be made on this because some of these domain owners will issue bounties for anyone who can find this. So there's money to be made. From a malicious actor's point of view, this is gold because this will greatly increase the efficiency of his phishing, particularly spear phishing attacks. So it's well worth the investment. So one of the things that is holding back kind of a big wave of very effective spear phishing attacks is just the barrier of being able to discover those records in the first place, right? I think. And so now, but from a defender's point of view, what we now have is a way of actually doing auditing. And we can do continuous auditing of our own domains for this. And so based on this data set now, instead of doing kind of a one-by-one lookup, we can actually build these data sets as searchable data sets. And that's a huge step up in tooling from a defender's point of view. So the original example that we had with Microsoft dangling records using dig, like we can easily find that using the same query tool in this one. So as Ken mentioned, we have this toolkit available in our community edition, and you can sign up and you can use this to do a few spot checks of your own domains and things like that. So it's a very very easy way of doing auditing and continuous auditing of these dangling records. Right? Because there's a very simple mitigation, and we'll look at that at the end. here. So there's a very, very simple mitigation for this problem. So let's look at what we can do with this. So here are some examples of successful takeovers that we have performed using this data. So the first few are from oxfam.co.uk. Oxfam is kind of a charity organization operating different brands. One of them is Oxjam, which is a music festival. There's other associated ones. And there's some other ones on the list here as well. Google CloudCDN.com is somewhat interesting for the reason that it was used to originally host files for some illegal gambling sites. And there might be other malicious stuff hosted there. So being able to take over one of those domains means that we now can create some visibility into malicious traffic and maybe even malware networks and things like that using this data. So the first example here, we'll start kind of from the basics and then build up on top of this. So Oxjam used to be an annual music festival organized by this charity. We have a screenshot from the Internet Archive. As we saw from our data set, we can see that the record for oxjam.org is a dangling record, and we're actually able to take over that one. So we have the original site there in pink and blue, and then we have our current holding page, a small, modest text page that we have, just holding this and showing that it's been taken over. So in step by step, how we do that, we find first that oxjam.org points to oxfamhosted.co.uk. So the problem here is that oxfamhosted.co.uk does not exist. So we buy that, and now we can configure a server of our own and set up this domain in DNS. So that's step one. The next step is that then now automatically this becomes part of that name chain that oxjam.org originally was pointing to. Because in the first step it failed, like it didn't complete, it never went to line 2, right? We have CNAMEs there and then that's it. So down the bottom here we now see that just by setting up the server and pointing it to something under our control, and with the DNS, now the DNS name chain, fully resolves, and we end up with this pointing to the IP address that is owned by us, and we have a web server on that. So what we have on that web server is a simple, basic HTTP site. That's where we start. But this now presents itself as www.oxjam.org. Like, remember, we didn't buy oxjam.org, right? We bought oxfamhosted.co.uk. So now we have a valid web server for oxjam.org, and traffic comes to us. So now what we can do is that we can use Let's Encrypt to request a SSL certificate for oxjam.org. Still, this does not belong to us, right? Because the way that the validation for certificates for Let's Encrypt works is HTTP-based. So that's why we have to set up a basic HTTP site first and get traffic to flow there because of the authentication method for Let's Encrypt. So then we do that. And then Let's Encrypt also has a very handy command line tool that automatically modifies our server configuration to include the SSL certificate and upgrade all of the connection traffic to SSL. When you do that in your browser, connect in here, you would have your green icon or whatever it is in your browser to say this is a fully valid domain certificate for this particular domain host, www.oxjam.org. So this is a very convincing way of actually getting trust from a web user. Like all of the things that he's been trained to check, they all check out because this is a fully valid, we're not impersonating anything at all. We're only working with valid information. So now we can see that we're getting traffic in. And typically, what you'd observe as well is that when you issue or request an SSL certificate and it's issued, it's also published on the certificate transparency log. So that fact attracts some traffic in itself, typically from indexes like Google and all the other search engines, but also people that might be monitoring that stream. So now we have a simple page on this particular host name, and we're showing that, but that's only because we're nice. If we were not nice, we could put anything up there, right? We could put something that would destroy or negatively affect, someone's reputation. But we could also start our own music festival. We could start Oxjam back up again, right? And remember from the first snapshot, there was a little link, send donations. Well, why don't we just, reanimate the site and put in a sell ticket or buy ticket link in there? Now we're selling tickets to a charity concert that is never going to happen, but we'll build up the hype around it. We can do anything we want because we now have a fully authentic website within that brand. So if we can do more of that, then we can do much more damage. So in this case, we're taking over the entire domain. And so the next thing I just point out is that, okay, so a lot of people say, we don't need to worry about this because we have brand protection on all of our domains. Like we have experts looking after this. And so that's nice. And you get a quarterly invoice, I'm guessing, and you're paying this. But it doesn't actually maybe do all of the things that you think it's going to do, because it's not going to protect you from DNS takeover, as we can see in this example, because oxjam.org is actually registered by one of those brand protection services, CSC in this case. But they didn't actually bother managing any DNS at all. They just bought the domain and reserved it, and so they ignored the whole problem of these records being able to be taken over. So you kind of feel that there's potential for a refund for this one. So anyway, we spent $1.99 to buy that Oxfam hosted .co.uk. So let's see what else we can get out of those $2, right? So then all we need to do now, because we have the full data set, all we need to do is to do a reverse lookup. And so the first thing we do is say, okay, we want other CNAMEs that are pointing here. So again, if you don't have the data, that's very difficult to do because that's not actually a native DNS function. You need to collect the data first. So that's what we do here. So now we can see that Oxjam is on the list. Okay, we knew that. Now we have behind the brands as well, pointing to the same domain. It's the host name is actually a little bit different. Doesn't actually matter, right? Because we have full control. This is our domain. We can do whatever we want. We can set up publications. We can hijack their internet as well, if we want. We don't, but we could. So behind the brands here, this is another example. So this is a variation of and we're starting to get into something that's a bit more dangerous now, because before we took over the entire site. And so, okay, yes, so we started from nothing. And depending on how long ago it was that original site was active, okay, maybe some risk has kind of evaporated in the meantime. Here, we're only taking over part of an actual fully operating domain. So now we're into something that has more potential to be actually dangerous, because now we're inside of the domain scope in a fully functioning domain. So the way that this works here is that, as we saw from the previous list, we have the host name pointing to us, but the main website is a fully valid one. There's no problem with that. But we can now see that down the bottom there, our holding page is now as a subdomain inside of that scope. So let's do the next iteration then, because we can do the same with CAA, which is the Canadian Automobile Association. And so this is also a fully functioning website. And they, as we can see on that page up at the top, they have a login function. And so typically that might operate through some kind of session. That would be a good guess. And depending on what scope that operates in, we might be able to get that. If we can get in on the subdomain level inside of this domain, we might be able to see those sessions. So let's try that. So we're very fortunate in this case that we have a host name or subdomain called tmportal that is a dangling record, which we can acquire. But before we go on to that one, I'll actually just point out the fact that if you connect to the real CAA site in your browser, and then connect to a subdomain within that same domain, your browser is going to present all of those domain cookies to the website, regardless of where that is. And the thing here is that from an attacker's point of view, the good thing is that the browser talks to us as the attacker before we decide what to send back to the browser. So that leaves us in a very strong position to do a lot of stuff with the information that the browser gives us. So if we're just looking at this from the client side in the browser, we can see the cookies here. So on the bottom part, we're in tmportal.caa and so on. And this is we control that one, because that was a dangling record now pointing to our server. But in our browser, inside of tmportal, we have the scope of cookies in the actual main domain, which is one level above the record that we have. So that means that if we can get the client's browser to send us those cookies from an attacker's point of view, we'd be able to capture whatever is in there. So let's try that. That turns out to be a lot easier than you'd think, because all we have to do is to implement one slight variation of our existing server configuration. We just need to add one keyword at the end of it, namely to log all of the HTTP cookies. And so when we do that, what happens is in the pale blue down the bottom, we now have in our log file all of the cookies that were sitting in the user's browser. So this is pretty useful, because now what we have all of the components that we need to build one of these, like a Stealthy drive-by cookie stealer. And the way that this works is, as we've already seen, we just configure a page on our server inside of our control, but inside of a subdomain scope of the target site. So then we get the user to click on a masked link that points to our host name, but actually immediately redirects back to the real site. So we can do that so quickly that the user doesn't actually recognize that he was anywhere else other than the site that he was expecting to go to. And so, but what happens in the background is that the user's browser connects to us, generously gives us all its domain cookies, and then immediately redirects back to the real site. So the user never knew what hit him, basically. And the outcome from our point of view is that we now have a copy of all of his cookies. And we can do that with those 3 snippets of, it's not even code, right? You can see it down the bottom. That's all we need. So in this case, we made it explicit that we actually have a detour page that we're linking to, but we don't need that. Like we can do that on the root of the subdomain as well, and then it'll be completely invisible. So to show you this kind of in a diagram fashion, we have a setup here which we can show you in our Sandbox in a moment. The target domain here is military-gateway.com. So this is the site that we want to break into, and actually being able to steal the session cookies that we can log into that without knowing what the credentials otherwise were. So this works through this DNS dangling CNAME chain, similar to all the other ones. But we want to break it down into 2 different views, right? Because what the user sees and what actually happens are 2 different things. So on the blue icons there, this is the user logging in with an active session into the militarygateway.com site. Then what we want to do is that we want to send him another link to click on. And he's very likely to do that because that link that we're sending him is actually inside of his own domain. So his content filtering network didn't show him anything, like it didn't trigger any alerts or anything. Like he clicks that, he thinks it's his own domain. it goes to our server. And so what happens in the background then is that the actual redirect chain is the orange one, right? It goes to the portal, and then it goes back up to military gateway transparently. But what the user sees are the green lines. He just sees that when he clicks on this, and he immediately ends up on that site. Problem now is that in the orange section, we now have those cookies, and then we can actually go to the military gateway site, end up on the login page. We don't need to log in, because all we need to do is replace the cookie in our browser. And I'll show you, can't do a live demo on this setup here, unfortunately, but I can run you through a quick reporting of how this works. So this is from the user's point of view. So the user is logging in to a protected page on his site. He now has it, right? Now we send him a link, and this is this link. He's clicking on this. Immediately he ends up on the same page he already was, so he doesn't notice anything. Now we're on the attacker's point of view. Now we can just check our log file down the bottom right. We have the session cookie. So let's copy that. So that's what we do here. Next, we are now no longer the user. We'll wipe out this one, start again. This is now on the attacker's PC. He's going to the page, but he's presented with the login page. No good. Now, all we need to do, find the cookies in our browser, replace the session with the one that we have in our log file. We don't need the login page anymore. Now we just click on this. Now we're in the user. Now we're logged in as the user. Right? So that's pretty simple. There's a lot, like I'm not a red team or anything like that. I'm looking at this from a defensive point of view. So I was pretty surprised how easy it was to set this stuff up. Right? But the consequence now is that we're in there, we stole his session without him noticing anything. We can now do anything that he can do because we're logged in as him. Okay, so this is a pretty significant attack vector here. And it works, obviously your imagination from as an attacker is the only limit to what you can do with this, right? So you have very good phishing attacks, you have very good spear phishing, all of these impersonation attacks, because all of those impersonation measures that you have in place are not relevant because you're not impersonating anything, you're working with real sites. Okay, so the good news is that it's very easy to prevent this from happening. Like I mentioned this before, all you need to do is to delete the dangling records, if you can find them, which you now can because you are now users on a free tool that tells you all of this stuff for all your domains. Problem solved. But in general, it's very good to have better hygiene and better processes around what you're doing. So things like inventory control, change management, auditing, using a tool like this, and monitoring. These are important things. If you're doing infrastructure as code, as I said, it's very important to have proper cleanup, and in case of failures and things like that. In the cases where that's not enough, go back and work through this mitigation list. Right? So I think in summary what I'd say is this is a real problem. You should worry about it. But there are easy things that you can do to prevent it from affecting you negatively. Right? That's the good news. And I think I'm almost out of time. If there's any questions, I'll try and answer some of them.
So in the last example you were showing, you kind of registered a subdomain within the domain. Wouldn't the domain registries block you from doing that because that main parent domain has already been allotted to somebody else? How would they let you kind of put a portal dot something? Exactly.
So like this was a demo setup because I didn't want to harm the innocent bystander in this demonstration. But the principle is that I don't need to do any of that because the domain owner has already done it for me. So that's the key thing, right? I don't need to do anything in the third-party domain. That's already been done. All I need to do is to hook up to what's already there. And this is completely outside of the scope of the original domain. So you're correct that I don't have any way of managing the DNS settings for that target domain. But I don't need to because it's already been done. The actual owner of the domain set those records up, but he didn't complete the chain. So I can hook up into that chain because what he should have done is he should have deleted that record, and I have no way of putting that in. Right? So the dangling records, and this is it's the common thing for all of those different record types, right? It's a very simple fix. Just clean them up, delete them. And because nobody else can do it, right? So I did not gain access to any of those domain zones at all. I only use what is already there. Correct. Yes. So these were already there. So this was the same we saw with the CAA, the same we saw with Oxfam, Oxjam, and so on. Same principle. So, and I understand your surprise because it's much easier than you think it should be, right? But yes. Okay, so we're out of time, so thank you very much for sitting through that.
So if anyone feels a little bit queasy after that about, do they have dangling records? There's a free audit tool available on silentpush.com. Sign up for the community app, and it's one of the many, many free security audit tools that we have on there. It's in our query builder. Look for experimental dangling DNS, and you can query your own or anybody else's DNS records, right, to see what's dangling. It's all already done for you, right? Just type in your own domain name and see what's there, right? Hope you all enjoyed that. Thanks.